I read a news story in a paper about a passionate drama where he killed her and then himself. Their love mattered to me, not their identities. It doesn't interest me because it makes me feel or think, but because it reminds me of a hunting adventure from my youth, where I saw love appear to me like the cross appeared to early Christians in the midst of the heavens. I was born with all the instincts and the senses of primitive man, tempered by the arguments and the restraints of a civilized being. I am passionately fond of shooting, yet the sight of the wounded animal, of the blood on its feathers and on my hands, affects my heart so as almost to make it stop. That year the cold weather set in suddenly toward the end of autumn, and I was invited by one of my cousins, John, to go with him and shoot ducks on the marshes, at daybreak. He lived in a house that was part farmhouse and part chateau, located in a wide valley with a river running through it. The hills on either side were covered with old monoreal woods, where there were still magnificent trees and where the rarest feathered game in that part of France could be found. Sometimes eagles were killed there, but birds that don't usually come to our crowded part of the country always landed in the giant oak trees. It's like they knew that this was a small part of an old forest that still existed to provide them with a place to rest at night. In the valley, there were large meadows watered by trenches and separated by hedges. Then, further on, the river, which up to that point had been kept between banks, expanded into a vast marsh. The marsh was the best place for hunting that I had ever seen. My cousin took care of it and made sure it was kept as a safe place for animals to live. He grew rushes on it and created narrow paths for boats to pass through silently using poles. The boats would brush up against the reeds, causing fish to hide in the weeds and wild birds with black heads to suddenly dive into the water. I really love the water of the sea, even though it's too big and always moving. I also love rivers, which are beautiful but always flowing away. But most of all, I love marshes because they are full of unknown aquatic animals. The marsh is like a whole different world with its own life, inhabitants, sounds, and mysteries. It can be very scary sometimes, especially at night with the rustling of the rushes, strange lights, and silence. The gentle splashing sounds can be more terrifying than the sounds of cannons or thunder. It feels like these marshes hold a dangerous secret that we don't know about. Perhaps the mystery of how life began on Earth started in these muddy waters, under the hot sun and heavy humidity. I got to my cousin's place in the evening. It was very cold and everything felt frozen. We had dinner in a big room where the walls and ceiling were covered with stuffed birds like hawks, owls, and falcons. My cousin, who was wearing a jacket made of seal skin, looked like a strange animal from a cold place. During dinner, my cousin told me about the preparations he had made for that same night. We planned to start our watch at 3:30 in the morning and get to the spot my cousin chose by 4:30 a.m. He built a hut made of ice to shelter us from the cold wind that comes before daybreak. This wind is so cold that it feels like a saw is cutting through your skin, like a knife blade, like a poison sting, like a pair of pincers twisting your skin, and like fire burning it. My cousin said it was the coldest he had ever experienced, with the temperature being 12 degrees below zero at 6 in the evening. After dinner, I went to sleep by the light of a bright fire, and my cousin woke me up at 3 in the morning. We got dressed in warm clothes, had coffee and brandy, and set out with our dogs and a gamekeeper. As soon as I went outside, I felt very cold. It was one of those nights where the air is frozen and everything seems dead with cold. The air was still and there was no wind, making it feel even colder. The cold air was painful and could dry you out. Even the trees, plants, insects, and small birds were affected by the cold and could die from it. They would fall from the branches and become stiff on the ground. The moon was looking weak and faint in the sky, as it was in the last quarter of its cycle. It seemed unable to shrink and disappear as usual, stuck in the cold, frozen night sky. Its light was pale and sad, as it often appears at the end of its cycle. John and I walked side by side, our backs bent, our hands in our pockets and our guns under our arms. Our boots, which were wrapped in wool so that we might be able to walk without slipping on the frozen river, made no sound, and I looked at the white vapor which our dog's breath made. We walked through a lane of dry rushes in a low forest on the edge of a marsh. As we touched the leaves, they made a slight noise. I felt a strong and strange emotion that marshes always give me. This marsh was dead and cold, with dried rushes all around. We eventually arrived at an ice hut that was built to shelter us while we waited for the birds to wake up. I wrapped myself in my rug and tried to get warm, but the cold from the marsh and the icy walls made me cough. From inside the hut, I looked at the moon, which had 4 horns and was visible through the walls. My cousin John became uneasy. "No matter if we do not kill much today," he said, "I do not want you to catch cold, we will light a fire." And he told the gamekeeper to cut some rushes. We built a fire in the middle of our hut, which had a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape. As the flames grew, they melted the crystal blocks of the hut. John, who was outside, called me to come and see something. I went out of the hut and remained struck with astonishment. Our hut, in the shape of a cone, looked like an enormous diamond with a heart of fire, which had been suddenly planted there in the midst of the frozen water of the marsh. And inside, we saw 2 fantastic forms, those of our dogs, who were warming themselves at the fire. We heard a strange and wandering cry while sitting by the fire, and saw wild birds flying over our heads. At this freezing time of morning, it feels like the passing cry carried by the bird's wings is the soul's sigh leaving the world. "Put out the fire," said John, "it is getting daylight." The sky was getting brighter and we could see ducks flying in long lines. 2 dogs ran ahead of us as we followed them. Suddenly, there was a burst of light in the dark as John fired his gun. We kept aiming at the flying ducks as they appeared over the rushes. Our dogs, Pierrot and Plongian, were tired but excited as they fetched the dead birds, whose eyes sometimes still looked at us. The sun had risen, and it was a bright day with a blue sky, and we were thinking of taking our departure, when 2 birds with extended necks and outstretched wings glided rapidly over our heads. I fired, and one of them fell almost at my feet. It was a teal, with a silver breast, and then, in the blue space above me, I heard a voice, the voice of a bird. It was a short, repeated, ear-trending lament. And the bird, the little animal that had been spared, began to turn round in the blue sky, over our heads, looking at its dead companion which I was holding in my hand. John was on his knees, his gun to his shoulder watching it eagerly, until it should be within shot. "You have killed the duck," he said, "and the drake will not fly away." He did not fly away but kept circling above us and calling out continuously. I have never been so pained by any cries of distress as I was by the pitiful appeal of this poor bird, lost in space and calling out in despair. At times, he flew away when threatened by the gun, as if he was ready to continue his journey alone, but he couldn't bring himself to leave his mate and so returned to her. "Leave the bird on the ground," John told me, "the male bird will come within range of the gun soon." The bird eventually approached us, not concerned about the risk, consumed by his love for his mate whom I had just shot. John fired, and the bird fell rapidly among the rushes. And Pierrot brought it to me. I put them, they were already cold, into the same game bag, and I returned to Paris the same evening.